Continuing our study of Unit 8, Structure and Function Within Living Systems, with Lesson 6. This will be our genetics introduction. And here's our warm-up. You will type your answer in the Zoom chat box. Which type of asexual reproduction is taking place in the scenario below? A planarian is a non-parasitic flatworm. If a planarian was injured by a predator, it could regrow its body parts. If the body parts were not eaten by the predator, the part could regrow into a whole new planarian as well. What would that be an example of? I'll pause for you to answer. If you answered C, regeneration or fragmentation, you are correct. Okay, our lesson goal, you should be able to define heredity as the passage of genetic instructions from one generation to the next generation. And our essential question, how are traits passed down from parents to offspring? And this is a supporting standard. And here are vocabulary words that will be bolded throughout the lesson. We have Gregor Mendel, principles of inheritance, dominant, recessive, principle of independent assortment, genetics, traits, genes, chromosomes, homologous pairs, alleles, homozygous, and heterozygous. Okay, we're going to start out with Gregor Mendel. He is commonly known as the father of genetics. And you can remember that because his first name starts with G and so does genetics. So Gregor Mendel, father of genetics. He established the principles of inheritance, and these describe the transmission of inherited traits, and he coined the terms dominant and recessive. So Mendel's principle of independent assortment describes how the inheritance of one trait has no effect on the inheritance of another trait. And let's watch how he used pea plants to determine this.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parents and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds. He called the yellow color trait the dominant one, because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plants self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of a gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous pea, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous pea, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype. To clearly visualize how alleles are distributed amongst descendants, we can use a diagram called the Punnett square. You just place the different alleles on both axes, and then you figure out the possible combinations. Let's look at Mendel's peas, for example. Let's write the dominant yellow allele as an uppercase Y, and the recessive green allele as a lowercase y. The uppercase y always overpowers its lowercase friend, so the only time you get green babies is if you have two lowercase y's. In Mendel's first generation, the yellow homozygous pea mom will give each pea kid a yellow dominant allele, and the green homozygous pea dad will give a green recessive allele, so all the pea kids will be yellow heterozygous. Then, in the second generation, where the two heterozygous kids marry, their babies could have any of the three possible genotypes, showing the two possible phenotypes in a 3-to-1 proportion. But even peas have a lot of characteristics. For example, besides being yellow or green, peas may be round or wrinkled. So we could have all these possible combinations: round yellow peas, round green peas, wrinkled yellow peas, and wrinkled green peas. To calculate the proportions for each genotype and phenotype, we can use a Punnett square too. Of course, this will make it a little more complex. And lots of things are more complicated than peas, like, say, people. These days, scientists know a lot more about genetics and heredity, and there are many other ways in which some characteristics are inherited. But it all started with Mendel and his peas.
So, if you've ever wondered, why do I have curly hair? Or why can I roll my tongue? Or why is my thumb shaped like a hitchhiker? These are all things that you have inherited, and they come from either your mom or your dad. Okay, so genetics is the study of how traits are passed from one parent to offspring. So some of the things that I mentioned would be like rolling your tongue. That's not something you learn to do. That is something that is inherited. Or hitchhiker's thumb. When you put your thumb up, is it curved or is it straight? We're going to do a lab later on to determine all this. So, do you have curly hair, straight hair? Do you have dimples? Okay, so this is all based on genetics. Traits are determined by the genes on the chromosomes. A gene is simply a segment of DNA that determine a trait. So just a segment of this strand of DNA. Remember, the body is always copying DNA and making new cells. Traits are determined by the genes on the chromosomes. Chromosomes come in homologous pairs. Thus, genes also come in pairs. And I know this is kind of tricky. You have to think about this. But homologous pair, it simply means that they're matching. So homologous pairs are matching genes. You get one from your female parent and one from the male parent. So humans have 46 chromosomes. Or, another way to say that, humans have 23 homologous pairs. Because 23 times 2 is 46. From those 46, you get one set from dad. That's 23 in the male sex cell, which is the sperm. And you get 23 a set from your mom. And that's from the egg, of course. All right. So, homologous chromosomes contain DNA that codes for the same genes. And in this example, both chromosomes have all the same genes in the same locations. And it's represented with these colored strips. But different versions of those genes represented by the different shades of each color. So again, we're not going to get really deep into genetics. It's just going to be an intro level. You will get deeper into genetics in the 9th grade. Okay, alleles. Alleles are different genes, so basically different possibilities for the same trait. So, example, blue eyes or brown eyes. So one pair of homologous chromosomes. That means gene for eye color. So blue eyes or brown eyes. Quick check. Who is called the father of genetics? Pause for you to answer. Type it in the Zoom chat box. If you answered Gregor Mendel, you are correct. Okay, let's go a little bit further with this. Dominant and recessive genes. Dominant, and when you think if someone's dominant, they're in control. Okay, so dominant genes are a gene that prevents the other gene from showing. They dominate over the recessive gene. So the recessive gene is a gene that does not show. even though it's present. So it's there, but it's being dominated by the dominant. Can you always represent the dominant gene with the uppercase letter? It is dominant. It dominates. The recessive gene is always represented with a lowercase letter. Okay, and they're just using the letter T in this. You can use any letter here, but just know that if it's capitalized, it's dominant. If it's lowercase, it's recessive. So, for example, in these puppies, black is the dominant color, and white would be the recessive color. Another example would be a straight thumb or a hitchhiker's thumb. A straight thumb is dominant. A hitchhiker's thumb is recessive. So a straight thumb is represented with the uppercase T, hitchhiker's thumb with the lowercase t. And you'll always use the same letter for the same alleles. So a straight thumb, if you have the combination of capital T, capital T, that's all you can get is straight thumb. Straight thumb here, the capital T dominates. So even though you have the recessive gene or allele, it's still going to be straight because of the dominant gene. Sorry. And then the hitchhiker's thumb, you can only get that if they are both lowercase. So both recessive. So there must be two recessive alleles for a recessive trait to show. All right, so anytime you've got a capital letter, it's going to be the dominant. And the only time you can get the recessive is if they are both lowercase. So if both the genes of a pair are the same, so if they're the same, it is considered homozygous or purebred. So if they're the same, capital T, or lowercase t, they're going to be homozygous. Now they're homozygous dominant if they're both capital. They're homozygous recessive if they're both lowercase. To get heterozygous, you've got if one gene is dominant and one gene is recessive. This is heterozygous, or it's a hybrid. Okay, so you have an uppercase and a lowercase. That's heterozygous. If you had capital B, that would be your black. Capital B with lowercase b, that would be black with a white gene, but still the black's going to take over. And lowercase b, that's going to be your recessive white. Okay, so homozygous, if both are the same, so capital T or lowercase t, either homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. If you have one of each, it's going to be heterozygous, a hybrid. So let's summarize. How are traits passed down from parents to offspring? Traits are determined by the genes on the chromosomes. A gene is simply a segment of DNA that determines a trait. Chromosomes come in homologous pairs, meaning genes also come in pairs. They're the same. So homologous pairs are matching genes, one from the female parent, one from the male parent. 46 in total, 23 pair. Dominant genes are a gene that prevents the other gene from showing, and a recessive gene is a gene that does not show even though it's present. Dominant genes are always represented with the uppercase letter, recessive with the lowercase. And let's summarize it up with a video.
I don't remember which grade it was where I learned something about my taste buds that can never be unlearned, but the event in the lesson with genetics has stuck with me forever. For you see, I learned that my taste buds cannot taste PTC. PTC stands for this. We'll stick with PTC. And it's a chemical that can be sold on these paper strips. It can be purchased under the name PTC paper, and it's popular in genetic classes because it has this fascinating quality. Some can put it on their tongue and immediately say, "Yuck, this is bitter." And some people, when they place the paper on their tongue, taste absolutely nothing. Well, unless you consider the paper. Does paper have a taste in itself? That's a debatable question, but the point is some people can taste PTC, and some people cannot taste PTC. And I was really disappointed because I remember that I was the only one there that could not taste it. So there was everyone getting this amazing science experience, and I couldn't taste a thing. Well, there may have been more than just me that couldn't taste it in the classroom that day, but they didn't seem as concerned by the fear of missing out of the PTC paper as I was. I remember someone trying to make me feel better, saying, "Oh, but it tastes bitter. You're actually lucky." Then they tried to describe what it tasted like to me, but it's not the same. I guess I'll never know for myself what it would have tasted like. Of course, the reason PTC paper is used in genetic classes is because the trait of being able or not being able to taste PTC is based on genetics. A reminder from our Intro to Heredity unit that genes are portions of DNA, and they have the ability to code for a characteristic, a trait, like being able to taste or not to taste PTC. Now, we do want to point out that many traits are actually coded for by interactions of more than one gene, like eye color, which is quite complex and determined by interactions of many genes together. In fact, the ability to taste PTC or not may involve some other gene interactions. There's even different ranges for how bitter the chemical may taste because there may be more kinds of alleles than we'll mention. More about that later. But since we do know that the ability to taste PTC or not taste PTC is at least heavily impacted by a specific gene, it does make it powerful for genetic classes. One thing I have found so interesting is that my parents can both taste PTC. So why can't I? Recall that humans have 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes are made up of DNA and protein. It's a condensed unit of DNA. My whole genetic code is represented by these chromosomes. You inherit 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 chromosomes from your father. Here's all 46 of them right here. As you can see, there are 23 chromosome pairs. Each pair has one chromosome from one parent and one chromosome from my other parent. If we focus on one of these pairs of chromosomes where the PTC taste sensitivity gene may be found, we can see an area where the PTC taste sensitivity gene could be. Let's assume this is the locus where the PTC taste sensitivity gene is found. See how it is pointing to a specific area here? That's because it's on an area of the chromosomes that refer to a specific gene that codes for a trait. Now, remember how this chromosome is from mom. This one is from dad. Each parent contributes an allele, which is a variant of a gene. An allele is a variety of a gene, a form of a gene. The alleles could be the same form of the gene or different forms of the gene, but regardless, in this case, they're forms of the gene involved with PTC taste sensitivity. So, if PTC taste sensitivity is being used as a one gene trait example, and as we mentioned, it may not be that simple, then your DNA code has a gene related to PTC taste sensitivity. Together, the two alleles you inherit, the forms of that gene, determine the trait of tasting PTC or the trait of not tasting PTC. That gene is involved with coding for taste receptors on your tongue, and the receptors you have can make a difference for whether you taste PTC or not. The alleles are typically represented by letters. Since this is all about tasting, let's use the letter T. But wait, it matters whether I represent it as a capital or lowercase letter. If I use a capital letter to represent an allele, it means that it's a dominant allele. If one or both of the alleles you inherited for a trait are dominant, then it will be expressed. More about that later. If I use a lowercase letter to represent an allele, that means it's a recessive allele. Recessive alleles are typically not expressed unless there is no dominant allele present. Now, remember that you have two allele copies, so the combination you could have here could be big T, little t, or little t. These are called genotypes, your genetic makeup. Genotypes can help determine a phenotype, which is a physical characteristic. You'll notice when writing genotypes, I put the capital letters first, if it contains a capital letter. That's not because the order matters, it's a formatting formality that capitals are written first. It turns out that being able to taste PTC is a dominant trait. That means the phenotype, which is a PTC taster, is due to a genotype that includes at least one dominant allele. So which genotypes can taste PTC then? Well, big T can. Both of those alleles are dominant. So can big T little t, because remember, it only takes the presence of one dominant allele. In fact, the only genotype in this simplified example to not be able to taste PTC would be little t. So obviously that is what I am. I am the little t genotype, which results in my non-taster phenotype. But my parents can taste PTC. So what genotypes would they have to be? Well, if they were both big T, that wouldn't be possible. If one was big T and one was big T, that still wouldn't be possible. Remember, you have to get an allele, a form of a gene, from each parent. If my parents do taste PTC and I do not, then my parents have the genotype big T, and their phenotype is PTC taster. Punnett squares can be used to determine the probabilities of offspring having certain genotypes, which then can be used to determine their phenotypes. But Punnett squares are for another Amoeba Sisters video. Before we end, one more thing to mention. In this example, the dominant trait of being able to taste PTC is more common than the recessive trait of not being able to taste PTC. And one could jump to an assumption that dominant traits are more common, especially since it only takes the presence of one dominant allele to show up in the phenotype, at least in Mendelian inheritance. But the dominant trait is not always more common in a population, because it's possible that the dominant allele itself is more rare. That can be the case with some forms of polydactyly, that is, being born with extra fingers. Some forms of polydactyly can be a dominant trait caused by the presence of at least one dominant allele. However, the dominant allele may not be as common in the population, and the condition of having extra fingers is generally rare. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right, so genetics gets really, really deep. So we're going to keep it surface level in 7th grade. But I think it is just so cool to think about all of these different traits that we have and where they came from. It's just really neat to me. All right, so for your exit ticket, which is heterozygous? If you answered capital T, lowercase t, you are correct. Heterozygous, they are not the same. All right, so that was our intro on genetics, and I'll tell you what we're doing next.